Thanks for joining me, everyone. If you have not met me yet, I'm Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans, and I stumbled ass backwards into mindfulness and insight meditation in 1998 during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression that had blown up into agoraphobia. I was suffering from panic disorder and was unable to leave the house without melting down. I was on short-term disability, the whole shooting match. Happened to get paired up with a psychologist who, even back then, was already several decades deep into teaching and practicing mindfulness and insight meditation. And he offered me these techniques to work on the issues that I was dealing with. And I was not thrilled. My feeling was, hey, I can't even go out of my house, let alone do something social or work. And here's this guy saying, let's watch the breathing for a while. Fantastic. Thanks. He didn't give me anything else, and I was sitting at home all day anyway. And I figured, okay, I'm going to try this just long enough so I can go back to him and say, look, dude, this didn't work. Can I have the real treatment now? And it's been almost 25 years since then, and I haven't had that conversation with him yet. And here I am doing stuff like this. So I found that there's actually something to all of this. It's worked out pretty good for me. And so here we are. Today's talk is the sneakiest attachment of all. And there tends to be some confusion around this. So before we even jump into what this sneakiest attachment is, the first thing I want to talk about is what we mean by attachment, and even more specifically to start, what I don't mean. When we talk about attachment, sometimes there's this confusion point of, well, if I'm supposed to be non-attached, unattached, detached, I mean, that means I'm not going to care about anything? I'm going to be some unfeeling, inhuman, robotic? No. It's not that. It's not that. I think the easiest way to illustrate what I mean by that is there's this old saying in spiritual circles that everything that we do either comes from a place of love or a place of fear. Now, the first time I heard that, I didn't really buy it. I was like, oh, what about this and this and this? The longer I go through my own spiritual journey, the harder and harder time I have arguing with that sentiment. I really find it to be more and more true as I go. So everything coming from either love or fear. Well, there's a difference between holding space for feelings and grasping at feelings, trying to keep the ones that we want and push away the ones that we don't. There's a difference between unconditional love and hinging our well-being on someone or something being a certain way. I've never found that to end well. Okay? This grasping, this hinging, these things, these come from a place of fear. And in Buddhism, they're typically referred to as attachment, clinging, craving, sometimes what I call requirements for happiness. And these are typically called the source of suffering. The Buddha only taught one thing: how do we alleviate our own suffering? And very often what we'll hear is attachment is the cause of suffering. Clinging is the cause of suffering. There's an American monk I quote a lot named Thanissaro Bhikkhu. And I like what he has to say about it, which is the vicious cycle that arises and that we perpetuate, the vicious cycle of attachment in itself is suffering. It doesn't cause suffering. It is suffering. And I want to say, when I say suffering, not talking about, we're Sisyphus climbing up a mountain and trying to push it doesn't have to be that. Another thing that Thanissaro Bhikkhu says a lot is, instead of, let's throw suffering out because that has a lot of baggage, just think of stress. Stress. Simple stress. right? It's not so much that attachment causes suffering and stress. Attachment is suffering and stress. And the insights that I've had in my practice that led me to my realization about what I'll be talking about as this sneakiest attachment, I had those insights several years before I ever read Tanasaru Bhikku's writings on the topic, but they align perfectly. So this really resonates with me. So to fully understand what I'm on about here, I want to talk for a moment about how attachment arises and our active role in the process. We live in what's often referred to in Buddhist circles as conditioned existence. A conditioned existence, which is kind of a fancy way of saying we live in a world where there's cause and effect. We inhabit bodies where there's cause and effect. And these causes and effects are not always linear, right? It's not always an A to B. We can't just, sometimes we can go, okay, I push this object and it falls over. Okay, we can see that. But it's not always like that, is it? If you think about any of the political or social upheaval that we've seen just in the last few years, forget about the rest of human history or even what came before that, right? These things have millennia of causes that have come together in uncountable ways and created all sorts of effects, which in turn became causes for other things until we end up seeing some of the things that we see today. To even take a more basic example, imagine the scope of causes and effects that have had to take place for all of us to be here right now today together. For you to be hearing my voice, for us to be seeing these representations of each other's faces on this thing called Zoom, right? Each of our parents had to have had us, and their parents them, and their parents them, and their parents them, just for us to be here today. And then think of all the causes that have come up in your life that brought you to check this thing out. What are the odds that this collection of people would even exist in this moment, let alone all be here together on this thing called Zoom, on this thing called the internet, right? The problem we run into with these non-linear causes and effects is our perceptions are based on limited information. We can't see all this crap going on behind the scenes. We have this limited perspective, both in a physical sense, right? Pretty much everyone here is probably sitting on a chair right now or a sofa or something. And whatever it is that you're sitting on has the appearance of being this solid, permanent object, right? Well, a quick look under a microscope will tell you it's not real solid. You look down deep enough, it's all atoms moving around that are just packed together densely enough that to our limited perception of touch and sight, it seems solid. But it's not. It seems permanent. But it's not. And it's not just physically. We have this psychologically as well. We have this limited perception psychologically to the point where the same way with like a couch or a chair, we have this concept of a permanent, solid self, right? And that's, of course, a whole other topic in itself of, is there a self? What is the self? And so forth. But we have this concept of a self that, of course, can't be the self. It's just a concept. So because we are operating on limited information, as well as our own past conditioning, the thought and behavior patterns that we've been engaging in for decades, which themselves have been based upon limited information. Because of all this, we are subject to delusion or ignorance. Ignorance in the sense of literally not knowing. Just not knowing. And one of the effects of these causes is that these misperceptions of internal and external permanence, solidity, meet and give rise to what kind of thoughts? Well, there's a solid me. There's a solid that thing over there. I want that. I want that. Or it's reverse. I don't want that. And we start to generate storylines around that, right? I want that thing because this. I want that. I need that car for this reason, and I need that amount of money for that. And get that situation away from me. That's unacceptable. That's no. I do not want that. This is craving. This is the root of craving, attachment. This is where it all starts. And what's really interesting is notice how craving, attachment, isn't just an effect caused by the sense of having a self. It's also a cause for having a sense of self. It's cyclical. Because if there's wanting, if there's needing, well, who wants? Who needs? I guess I do. Me. I want. I need. And then maybe we get that thing that we thought we wanted. Well, what is it? I have. That's mine. And what happens here? We start to solidify. I often like to say calcify. This sense of identity. A sense of identification with these things. These things we want, these things we don't want, these things we think we have and don't want to lose. And this is how we end up on that hamster wheel of running towards pleasure and running away from pain. Which is why even though we usually say we're seeking happiness, it turns out we're actually seeking comfort. Right? This is why we stay in bad situations sometimes. Better the devil you know, right? We're trying to maximize feelings of comfort and safety. So this cycle of this unclear seeing based on our limited perception, and then the unskillful thought, speech, and action that comes from it, which then serves to further perpetuate the unclear seeing, that cycle, that's suffering, that's stress. That is the cycle of attachment. That's why attachment doesn't cause suffering. Attachment is suffering. In this practice, mindfulness, insight meditation, vipassana practice, we cultivate clear seeing so that we can think, speak, act more skillfully in tune with the reality of conditioned existence. The cycle again. There's this unclear seeing based on our limited perception, because we can't see all of the causes and effects that are happening, particularly ones that have happened over the course of, millennia, right? If we want to take it to that extent. Based on our misperceptions of that unclear seeing, we engage in thought, speech, actions, and so forth that are not skillful. For example, like trying to keep something that is always changing because it's a conditioned existence. Everything is changing. Trying to keep them static. We have a perception that things are a certain way, but that perception is not the way they actually are. But we are engaging in thought, speech, and action based on the perception out of this ignorance, this not knowing that it's inaccurate. And because we're engaging in those behaviors, we get ourselves into trouble because they aren't in alignment with reality. And then we just dig the groove deeper. So what we're doing in this practice is working to reverse that cycle. Now, how the hell do we do that, right? We focus on the process of attachment in itself. Some of the things that I've already shared and the things that I'm about to share, like this sneakiest attachment, come from my practice of watching the process of attachment play out in itself, rather than getting caught up in the content of the storylines that I'm generating about it, the I need that because and I don't want that because and all that, right? We can't observe the process of that attachment and how we're writing those storylines about it. We can't observe that and be engaging in writing the storylines at the same time. It's the writing of the storylines and getting carried away by them that's the problem. It's like the engine. If we watch what the engine is doing rather than getting carried away by it, now we start to learn about the process. Now we start to gain some clear seeing. That's what allows us to then engage in thought, speech, and action that's more in tune with what's actually happening, and start to get ourselves out of the vicious cycle that we've been perpetuating instead. What we're really doing is turning the process inward on itself and seeing more clearly into the subtleties of it, which is exactly how I, for myself, stumbled into this sneakiest attachment insight, which in later years, through reading other Buddhist texts, I was like, oh, okay, it looks like I'm on the right direction because they confirm what I've just found, or what I had found a few years earlier. And it's this, okay? When I started working directly with the process of attachment, I found 3 levels. And this is just for me. I'm not saying this is the way it is. This is what I found for myself. In the course of your practice, you may find 18 levels, what have you. This is what I found for myself and how I've thought of it ever since. At the highest level of attachment, this is the simple level. This is the one that's focused on that external object. I want that car. I want that money. I want that relationship. I want that job. I don't want that thing to happen. I don't want that thing to happen. I don't want that. Looking outwards. Attachment to things. What we normally think of as attachment, right? And that can even include, if you want to go down that road, that can include things like attachment to the self, right? It doesn't have to be a physical object. It can be something conceptual. But as I started working with it, okay, I realized, you know what? It has nothing to do with the thing itself. There's always a because. I want that thing because. I don't want that because. And what's that because? Well, that because was inevitably feeling. I want that thing because I think it will make me feel happy. I think it will make me feel secure. I think it will make me feel safe. I think it will make other people think I'm a worthy person. That's what it's really about. It has nothing to do with the external thing. That's when I realized, no, it's not attachment to these things. It's attachment to feelings. That in a sense, I'm giving myself, because I have all the feelings with, I have the capacity for all these feelings in me right now, right? So it's like you're giving yourself permission. I need to have that thing so I can give myself the permission to experience this feeling, which of course is in me right now. It has to be, right? So I went from attachment to things to attachment to feelings. And as I got deeper, here's where I found what I have come to think of as the sneakiest attachment of all. In those moments when things got very still, very quiet, the mind really quieted down, and I was seeing the process of attachment in subtler and subtler nuance, I found that I was attached to attachment. Even when there was nothing being presented externally or internally, an object, a feeling, when there was nothing being presented per se to be grasped for, I noticed myself wanting to grasp. It's like attachment, craving, clinging, grasping. These things had become so habitual. We're doing it on autopilot. We've been running on the hamster wheel for so long. We don't know that there's a stop, that there's a jump off. It's so deeply ingrained. One of the ways I think about it sometimes, I call it addiction without discrimination. What I mean by that is I've noticed I will want to think. I'll grasp for thinking because I feel like I need to, be doing something or be solving something or be entertained by something. As long as I'm, another word that gets used a lot, feeding, as long as I'm feeding on something. And I say without discrimination, it doesn't matter what it is. As long as it's something. Look at the lengths we go to not to feel bored, right? And have we escaped boredom? With all of our attempts and all of the things available, we're overstimulated to death, right? But we're still feeding. And we still experience boredom, don't we? So what I found is if something is not presented to me for long enough, and sometimes it's just a few seconds, I'll go looking for something to chase after. The existence of an external thing is not necessary as a cause for attachment. It is entirely within us. Which is good news because that means we can do something about it. We can work with it. But I really want to drive that point home is that in my experience, we don't need anything to cause the process of attachment beyond our own motivation. The reason I found this insight so critical about this attachment to attachment is one of the things that I talk about a lot is what I call a shatter point. Won't get into the whole thing about where that came from here, but in short, it's about concentrating our attention, our energy, our focus in the right areas to get the results that we are looking for. Our problem isn't that we're not trying hard enough in life. Our issue is usually we're applying our energy in the wrong area. The way that I think of it is when I was envisioning external objects and even feelings, even internal feelings as the focus of attachment, as the source of attachment, to me, those are like handcuffs. And I kept trying to free myself from the handcuffs by trying to pry off the actual cuffs around my wrists. Recognizing that the real source here was attachment to attachment itself, and seeing that was suddenly like I had shifted my focus from the cuffs on my wrist to the chain holding the two cuffs together. And suddenly I got to see that break. That was where the energy and the attention needed to be focused. And at that point, well, geez, my hands are now freed. The cuffs may be still on my wrist, but who cares? Now they're just jewelry, right? The last point I want to make is a word that you might come across in Buddhist texts a lot is dukkha, which is commonly translated as suffering, craving, attachment. Another word is dissatisfaction. What we're doing here is, rather than turning our mental mirror outward and trying to grasp onto our perceptions of what's being reflected onto that mirror, which is impossible, right? Rather than turning our mental mirror outward and trying to grasp onto the perception of what's being reflected onto it, we turn that mirror, our attention, inward to clearly see through the process of the dissatisfaction that is motivating us to turn that mirror outward in the first place. This is how we short circuit that vicious cycle of attachment. Because we're not just going to tell it, stop doing that. That's not going to work, right? We turn that mirror inward and effectively see how the sausage is made. What's driving this process? And remember, we are not passive recipients of our experience. When something arises, we do something with that. So, where's this coming from? But also, what am I doing with it? And how does that affect what arises next? And then what do I do with that? And we start to see this cause and effect. Like I said at the beginning, this conditioned existence. What are the conditions? What are the causes? What are the effects? And those effects, they become causes for the next effects. Simply seeing that process helps it to begin to unravel. Because it's not any more solid, static, or permanent than your chair or your couch or yourself. So this is good news. We have something, suffering, dissatisfaction, feeding, attachment, that is all happening within us, and it's changeable. So the things that I'm describing, they're not all necessarily going to happen in a 20-minute meditation. Okay? These are things that I arrived at over years, and you should not take my word for any of it, by the way. These are things that I'm simply sharing my experience. You'll find yours. But these are things that you might keep an eye out for and say, oh, there's that thing. Or you might find something and say, that dude doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. It's like this. And yeah, for you, maybe it is. and that's fine. But let's work with it a little bit, and we can each find out what comes up for you today. And whatever that is or isn't is fine. It's completely fine. Let's sit for a bit. The one thing that I like to mention before we sit is, if you are seated, to have your hips elevated higher than your knees if possible, which is helpful both for breathing and your posture. If that is not possible right now, not a big deal. Something to keep in mind for the future, perhaps. And let's begin, as we always do, by imagining that we are suspended from the ceiling by a string attached to the top of our head, as a nice cue to sit up straight, without adding any extra tension to do so. If you're noticing any tension in your body right now, any tension in your mind right now, that's completely fine. There's no need to interfere with it. It's enough to simply know that it's there and allow it to be there. And I also like to bring my attention to that chair that we were talking about before, or that couch, or the floor, whatever is underneath you and supporting you right now. Notice that there is a sense of grounding, of being supported. Notice that feeling of grounding at the bottom and that lifting at the top, and whatever else happens to be in between the two for you right now. And if you haven't yet, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. And notice if your breathing changes once you bring your attention to it. For most of us, it does. It's very difficult to bring our attention to our breathing and not have it change a little bit. Now, in this practice, I don't teach that we need some kind of meditative breath, whatever we might think that is. Something long and deep and contemplative, right? Your meditative breath is the breath that you are observing while you are meditating. It's just that simple. You are sitting. Not that you have to be sitting to be meditating. Perhaps you're standing. Perhaps you're lying down. And you're watching the breathing. That's your meditative breath. Now, we may have brought with us an attachment to a concept of what our meditative breath should be. Perhaps what our meditative breath should feel like. Perhaps what we think a meditation session will do for what our breathing feels like. We have an expectation, a demand. It has to be like this. Well, our practice is watching that play out if that's what's happening. Everyone who is attending this right now has a reason, right? And that's absolutely fine. Again, it's about cause and effect. We want to engage in skillful causes, so we get skillful effects, right? But now that we're here, you've already set the condition, you're already here. Don't have to worry about that. You made it. Now that you're here, notice. What am I trying to get out of this? What am I requiring from this? What's my agenda here? What's my expectation? What do I feel like I need to get from this for it to be worth my while? How am I judging whether this is successful or not? What's my requirement for happiness with this? And I'm not saying that those are bad thoughts. We all have them. We have to. We couldn't survive without them. What I'm saying is, rather than getting caught up in their content, watch the process of them being written. And that's something that comes with practice. If this is something you haven't done before, you may say, well, how the hell do I do that? Don't worry too much about it. Just notice that they're there. Well, gee, I thought he was going to talk about something completely different. Okay, notice that. I'm not quite sure what the hell he means. Okay, notice that. He's talking too much. He should shut up. Notice that. Let's take a few minutes. Notice your breathing exactly as it is. And watch when we do that, what comes up. And just see it. Just see it. If you get caught up in a storyline, which we all do, we notice it and come back to our breathing. If one of the storylines that pops up when we notice that we've fallen into a storyline is that we messed up, we're a bad meditator, not doing this right, just notice that's just another storyline. And the noticing of that is the practice. Thinking we're bad at this is the content. Noticing that we're thinking we're bad at this, well, that's the process. That's the practice. You may also try working with this at a physical level, quite literally with grasping or clinging. If you perhaps notice, like I was saying before, a part of your body that is experiencing tension. Simply bring attention to it. We can't force it to relax. That's bringing tension to tension, right? The same way we can't try to force ourselves to stop feeling attachment, right? Because isn't that just attachment to non-attachment at that point? Craving, non-craving, right? It's a trap, isn't it? So that's not the skillful route. That's not applying our energy in the right place. We don't think that simply observing the process could possibly be enough until we've genuinely done it. And we see that it really is. It really actually is. And something to consider that I've found very helpful in my practice. Much of what I've been talking about today comes under the heading in Buddhism of what's often called the 3 characteristics. What I've also seen as the 3 perceptions of conditioned existence, which are largely the things I've been talking about, this impermanence, suffering or stress coming up around our attachments from our unclear seeing. But there's also a third aspect, which is not self, which often gets misconstrued as there is no self. And again, this is coming from Tanasaru Bhikkhu. He presents it a very different way, in a way that I find not just more relatable, but much more effective, much more actionable, particularly around what we're talking about today. He says that not self isn't some kind of metaphysical declaration. Not self is a judgment call. Not self is saying, are these things that I'm grasping for, that I'm attached to, that I'm clinging to, that I'm feeding on, are these things worthy of being identified with? Are they sufficiently reliable that it's skillful for me to identify with them, to be attached to them, to cling to them? Is that really paying off? Is it worth it? Or is it causing stress and suffering? In my experience, when we really see that clearly, when we see the process of attachment, and we see what I have found to be the unworthiness of trying to self things, I don't really have to do much of anything. I don't have to try to stop attaching. I've seen. That's why we're cultivating this clear seeing. It's enough. When someone hands us a hot potato, we drop it immediately, right? It's clear. We don't have to try to let go. We let go. Now, this is a little harder, but it's the same principle. Come to the breathing. Notice what arises. And what our reactions and responses are. to what it is that arises. And what that then leads to. I've made several references to Tanasaru Bhikkhu today, and I'm going to close the sitting with a combination of a couple of short quotes from him that I've seen recently. You've got to protect your concentration because the mind is used to looking for happiness in lots of ways. It likes variety. That's because the happiness it's used to is not satisfactory. It satisfies some things, but then there are other parts of the mind that are not satisfied. So you keep looking for different pleasures, and the mind keeps looking for new things to think about. A lot of the training is aimed at expanding your range of imagination. It's possible to find happiness in life without giving in to your old attachments. The more you see the drawbacks of the attachments, the more willing you'll be to listen to the Dharma, to expand your imagination of what's possible. Couple of announcements before we go into some Q&A. I'll put a few links in the chat, as I always do. These free sessions are supported by various methods. First link there is to my website where I offer one-on-one sessions for folks who might have something going on that you'd like to explore, see how this practice may help in the way that it's helped me and so many others. There's a link to my YouTube channel. Feel free to subscribe there. There's a lot of sessions up there. Some of these, some of my other sessions that you'll also find out on Insight Timer and Simple Habits, some of those places. My Patreon page for anyone who would like to help support on a one-time or recurring basis. A bunch of my sessions are up there as well. If you have any questions, anything you'd like to share, any experiences. Hey, Chloe.
Hey there. A comment and a question.
Great.
And the comment was, it was just my theory that these attachments are hardwired. Because I guess in prehistoric times, it was important to keep gathering nuts and berries and hunt meat and maybe have a partner so you can be safer and procreate and be not lonely, etc. So if we don't want to be attached to these things, I think there's a great deal of overcoming involved. And I just thought, like, it's important then when I notice an attachment to apply self-compassion rather than criticism, because it's that hard.
Very much so. So I'm 100% on board with the latter part, yes. The compassion instead of the criticism, yes. Because when I started the talk today, I talked about things coming from love or from fear. And the compassion is coming from love. The criticism's coming from fear. Compassion is making space for what is arising. Criticism is telling it to get the hell out. And criticism, ironically, is sort of a manifestation of having an attachment to non-attachment. Oh, attachment has come up and it shouldn't. That's bad. Get out.
Mm-hmm.
So, correct. That's not helpful. And in fact, actually perpetuates the suffering. And that leads me into the first part of what you said, which is I would not equate some of the things that you were talking about as being attachments per se. It's kind of a fine line. But when we talk about attachment, we're really talking about suffering. It is skillful to do the things that we need to do. We need to eat. We need to gather things and so forth. If our prehistoric friend knows that he or she needs to go out and get some stuff, well, that's probably skillful. They're in a conditioned existence, and the condition is hunger, and the condition is this, and the skillful thing to do is, okay, you do this, and you do this, and you do this. These are the things that you do. When we start ruminating, when we start storylining, that's suffering. That's suffering. One of the examples that I give a lot is if somebody punches you in the arm, you're going to experience pain. But we're all going to handle that in a different way. Some people will sit and stew on it for the next, I don't know, maybe years. And they're going to suffer. Some people could forget about it instantly. Like, okay, what an asshole, and then you're done. And they both experienced pain. But only one has experienced suffering, and there's an attachment there, an attachment to a storyline of, say, nobody can do that to me. I need to get revenge for that, and, that sort of stuff. Non-attachment doesn't mean that we don't take care of the things that need taking care of, because then we start falling into the happy horseshit of like, oh, I shouldn't take aspirin when I have a headache because that just means I'm attached to not having a headache. No. Attachment is requiring something that cannot be changed to be different than it is. Or I shouldn't say cannot, but cannot be in alignment with exactly how we want it to be is probably a better way to put it. So if our prehistoric friend goes out to gather food for the night and can't find any, they may experience the pain of hunger that night. If they are attached to the storyline that it is unacceptable to experience hunger, there's going to be suffering. But there is no suffering inherent in the pain of hunger. It may be incredible pain. I'm not minimizing the pain. It's what we're putting on top of it. It's what we're layering on top of it. This is why you'll see like the proverbial monk who can go set themselves on fire in the town square, right? And you better believe, I imagine they're feeling some incredible pain. I don't think they're able to go through it because they have no sensation in their body. They're just not adding anything on top of it. It's kind of an extreme example. But I hope that clarifies a little bit. Not every sort of, I'm feeling this, so there's a type. No, we're really talking about the suffering aspect of it, not the pain per se aspect of it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But to your point, the roots of these things come from these fears that we do have left over from, like I talk about a lot about the prehistoric days, the African savanna and all that, the saber-toothed tiger and the threats and that is a lot of our problem today, is that how we deal with pain that isn't life-threatening. The same fight or flight mechanisms still kick into place as when they were life-threatening, which is just another example of how we're not in tune with the reality. Our subconscious mind and body is not yet it hasn't caught up to this world that we've built for ourselves. So it's not responding in a way that is commensurate, in a way that's in alignment with reality. This is why we have to spend so much time working with our fear. It's because the fear is there, but it's spinning up all of these storylines that made sense tens of thousands of years ago that no longer do. And we need to clearly see that in order to begin unraveling that process. We can't just tell it, stop. Because if you could, no one would be here. Listen, I wouldn't be sitting here doing this, right? I'd have told it stop 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and, done. This is why we need to practice the clear seeing, because it's not at that it's not at that intellectual verbal level. This is pre-intellect, pre-verbal. It's deeper than that. We have to see it. We have to see it experientially. But I love what you said about the compassion and the criticism. That's exactly it. When this comes up, like I said at the beginning, there's a difference between holding space for a feeling and grasping at a feeling. We hold space. That's where the seeing happens. If we're criticizing, we're not seeing. We're not seeing. We're saying, no, you have to be that way. And it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So, was that the comment and the question, or you still have the question?
There's still a question. Do I have time?
Yes, please.
Okay. So last night I was reading, and then I remembered, there's still some Halloween candy. And I was like, I could have one of those little Reese's. And then I said to myself, well, are you hungry? And I said, no. And I'm like, well, okay. And then I was kind of like, but, it's a nice, pleasant thing, to have that Reese's, but I'm not hungry. And I had it anyway. So in that, there was no shatter point. Can attachments erode rather than shatter?
Oh, yeah. Don't get too caught up in the terminology of shatter point. This is an interesting practice in the sense that we do sometimes have these sudden flashes of insight, but even those sudden flashes of insight when they come, and of course we don't get to say what they are or when they come, and the shortest way to make sure they don't is to try to make them. But even those flashes of insight, as sudden and instantaneous and unbeckoned as they may seem, are based upon lots of practice that has been gradually leading up to them. Literally setting the conditions, the causes for that eventual effect, which in itself becomes a cause for more practice and insight. So it's not like everything is going to happen either all at once or through a gradual erosion process. It's both. And both parts are necessary. Both parts will happen. And the good or bad news, whichever way you want to take it, is you have no say in the matter which it is at any given time. The good news of that is you don't have to try to make it one way or the other. You just see what plays out. But I don't know that I necessarily agree offhand that there's no shatter point there. In an example like yours, which was great because you started going down that road. Well, am I hungry? No, most people don't get that far, right? A lot of us don't get that far. We just go grab the thing and eat, right? Habitual, autopilot. No, you started going down that road. Am I hungry? Well, no. But I want to know. Fine. But there is an interesting opportunity there, isn't there? What if you still had it, but you sat for 10 or 15 minutes with that craving, with that desire, with the storylines that came up out of it, with what the mind presented when you said, no, not yet. Not right now. And we start to see wow, there's some agitation brewing, or there's maybe some pride brewing that, hey, I'm staving this off. Or, what comes up? What comes up when we tell those voices at the conference table we all have inside of us, right? When that voice is coming up saying, I want that thing. What happens when we say, not right now?
Because it seems like, the craving was an avoidance of some aversion, which I don't know what that was.
Yeah, that's just it. You don't know what it was. That's exactly it. It could be an aversion of, I don't want the taste that's in my mouth right now. I don't want to be bored. I want entertainment. I want to feel that. I want to feel that. That's exactly it. You don't know what it was. You sit for 10 minutes, sit for 15 minutes, sit for 20 minutes and say, yeah, what is it? What is it? That's setting the condition. That's setting a skillful cause and condition for insight. You're giving the answer to that question, which we've already established you don't know yet. Now you're giving it an opportunity to come out. Is it going to come out in 15 or 20 minutes? Maybe, maybe not. You might get part of it. Who knows? Like I said, ongoing practice. This is why we do this regularly, because that in itself is setting a cause and condition for the insights to arise. To me, that's the shatter point here. That's what I would say.
Well, thanks. That was super helpful.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. Cheers. Thank you. Hey, Gary. How's it going, man?
Good, Ronald. Thank you. Another great session. I would throw out that if you can investigate that wanting for up to 20 minutes or more, it generally resolves itself. The mind will move on to a new territory of wantingness.
Cheers, Gary. Appreciate it. Yeah, like you said, when we sit and make space for the wanting that's coming up at a certain time, we start to see it branching off into other wantings. And that's one of the things that also made this so profound for me in terms of the insights I've had around attachment and helping to unravel them is exactly that. When we sit and the mind stills a bit and we really start to watch the process as it's playing out, we start to see, oh yeah, I don't just want one thing. I want this, and then I want this, and then I want this. It's staggering sometimes to see how quickly the mind, I think the Buddha himself said, the mind is swiftly moving, seizing whatever it wants and this sort of thing. It's relentless. The mind is relentless. And we don't notice it most of the time because, well, a fish doesn't see the water it's in, right? I mean, we're just so used to it. And in those times when I've really gotten still and really gotten quiet and really watched it playing out and seeing how fast it's like when you see the Tasmanian devil doing the whirlwind thing, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. You don't realize, holy shit, is this happening all the time? It's like, yeah, it is. And guess what, pal? You're feeding it. You're feeding it. You're perpetuating it. You're feeding off of it. You're an addict to it. You're the dealer and the user. Yeah, seeing that and feeling that exhaustion really went a long way towards, yeah, let's maybe hop off this hamster wheel for a while. This sucks. Yeah. Cheers, man. All right, we can wrap it up there. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'm around. And we'll see you again real soon. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.